Let me give you some background to my presentation before it's set up here. I can assure you first that my presentation is probably not going to be quite as deep as the previous two, skin cancer and avatars and existence and that sort of thing. And in consultation with Richard, who is my neighbor, it's one of the advantages to having the organizer right next door to you in giving this presentation. I thought at first it was going to be, by the way, I'm Rob Bruno, I'm an assistant professor in communication studies at LaGuardia, and I originally thought that I was going to be presenting specifically about certain research or a paper, and after talking with Richard, I found that there was a little more freedom in the presentation, and being somewhat familiar with the TED Talks, I know that the philosophy behind the TED Talks is to spread ideas. So, like I said, this presentation's not going to be quite as deep as the previous two, but what I hope to accomplish is that I give you some ideas, that I kind of cast some ideas to the wind, and that you can think about them, and that these ideas can be equally considered by faculty and students. I originally put this together thinking that the main audience would be professors and faculty, but the fact is what I'm getting at affects students directly. So let me give you some background. Not that you would be or should be familiar with my research, but some of you might be looking at this and saying, what is Bruno's research has nothing to do with bias in higher education. So what's this about? So what I'm attempting to do is, and let me assure you that it is connected to my research, and hopefully you can follow my logic, and by the end you can see where I'm going with this. I'm trying to frame my point within a larger context. And so I'm going to use an example that I believe that we're all familiar with at first to get to my main point later, where I think that a real bias exists in higher education at the current time. So what am I talking about? Bias in higher education. I'm talking about our current obsession with lists and rankings. And this is something that certainly technology has something to do with it, the internet has something to do with it, but it seems like you can't turn any direction and not come across some sort of new list. I don't know if David Letterman kind of started us on this path with his top 10 lists years ago, but they're just all over the place. And I don't know what it is about the human need for that. We need some kind of organization, some kind of structure put on things. And I am talking specifically about our obsession with college and university rankings, in that you know what I'm talking about, U.S. News and World Report is probably the best example. It comes out every single year, and it ranks professional schools and four-year colleges and et cetera. And I really believe that this is to the detriment of the higher education industry, but also to the students, especially. And this is not advancing, so looking at my own education, I think it's funny that I went to Stony Brook, got my bachelor's degree at Stony Brook, and one of the things that you would hear at Stony Brook, they'd call it the Berkeley of the East. And then the place that I got my master's degree, Ohio University, was sometimes called Harvard on the Hocking. Now I'm sure that these aren't the only two institutions which co-opt this prestige element from other universities and college, this idea that there are elite programs within the educational landscape. And the place where I got my PhD, Purdue University, I don't really recall ever using any sort of tagline like that. Not that the universities themselves ever did that in an official capacity, but all I know about Purdue is that it was called the cow town to the north by Indiana University students. But I think it's really interesting that institutions themselves propagate this, okay? The institutions and the people who work for the institutions, primarily professors, promote this comparison and ranking. And I went to Ohio University. I probably, none of you are familiar with that institution, but I can't think of two institutions that are more different than Harvard and Ohio University. Harvard, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Ohio University, which is in public institution in the Appalachians in southern Ohio. So it's curious, but I also think that this is just the implication that we create with these rankings and these comparisons is that these so-called elite, prestigious institutions deliver a better education. That's the implication in these rankings. So what's the research say? I do have a little bit of research in this presentation. Well, the research is fairly inconclusive on this topic. So if you have to, what I'm getting at is that if you have to ask most people what the main reason they go to college for, most people would say for a job, to earn a living, to find a career, right? I think most people are going to agree with that. Of course, you know, we professors like to believe there are other things that you go to college for, but that's the main reason. But one of the most cited research studies out there actually compared elite institutions, and I know one of my colleagues here, Hugo, went to Yale, so I don't want to hurt his feelings or at all. But a comparison of those elite institutions compared with state universities when SAT scores were held constant, and that's important. That you can't just compare the students at Harvard and Ohio State and Rutgers without the proper controls. But when SAT score is held constant, there's no difference in earnings between the students. So this is my main point. So the point is, why does that bias remain, okay? And I think obviously it's because of it's rankings and it's because of branding and marketing. And I think that the new bias exists on the online level with online education. Not so much the institutions, because if you look at the three institutions here, these are all for-profit companies that came out of the gate first with online education. So I think that the bias exists now to online education, and whereas before, in the larger context where the bias was that the elite institutions were somehow better and provided a better education for students, now it's the opposite, is that online education is somehow inferior to traditional forms of education. The reason I put a bottle of Bud Light up there is because if you don't believe in the power of marketing and branding, this is Exhibit A. Okay, it's the #1 beer in the world, and there's no correlation to quality. Okay, it's completely because of marketing and branding. And the same thing applies to any other product, including higher education institutions. Who holds the bias? I think it's us. I think it's faculty. One of the main metrics in the U.S. News and World Report rankings is peer evaluation, peer institutional evaluation. That's one of the top metrics to coming up with that number. Okay, so we are the ones who perpetuate this this bias. And absolutely, I sit on some committees for online and hybrid technology at LaGuardia, and I see it, and I've seen it at my previous institutions, that our faculty is biased against online education. And I would say they cloak it in terms of we're trying to preserve the soul of higher education. And you know, we're doing it for our students because we care for our students. Well, I think it's fear. I think that the main reason that most faculty are against online education is they think that a computer is going to take their job. Okay, real quick, a real life example is that I've gotten 1 F in my entire academic career. That was my freshman year at Stony Brook. It was Sociology 101. It was a lecture hall, dwarfed this theater. It was 250 students. The professor I'm dating myself here, he used to write on, the older among us will remember transparencies. He would write on transparencies straight from the book he wrote, the textbook that he wrote, and the way that he assessed us in that class was a midterm and a final. That was it. At the time, my only concern was hiding the grade report from my parents. And I thought that I was responsible. I certainly was responsible for that grade. I blew it, but I also thought that the problem was in the system. Well, getting back to traditional education, this is a core method of our brick and mortar residential campuses, these huge lecture halls, okay, where the professor stands at the front of the class and lectures to a passive audience. Well, guess what? These two pictures, this isn't Stony Brook, this isn't Ohio State, this isn't a community college. These pictures are from Harvard and Stanford. Okay, 2 schools which are routinely ranked in the top 3 or 4 every year. You can't tell me that that is a superior form of teaching and learning. Again, what's the research say? When the proper controls are in place, same teacher, same curriculum, same assignments, there's no difference between student outcomes, either learning in person or learning online. The message I want to send is that faculty, professors are necessary for this. The technology just doesn't work on its own. We are actually the most important part of online education. And so this is the original title of the presentation that I sent to Richard, and that is a paper title that I'm working on. And that I believe that humans are behind the technology in online education, and the lessons and the assignments, etc., are all theoretically based upon communication theory, psychology, sociology. There's theoretical rooting behind the method. And the last thing I'd end on is this. Anybody who teaches at LaGuardia or anywhere else, I wish I had some more men in there and probably a little more diversity in the class, and probably give another student or two a phone. This is what we see every day. We see our students on their phones in the middle of class, and half the seats are empty. Okay? I think that both of those situations really argue for online education, where students are less receptive to sitting in a classroom passively, and we know the power of technology. Thank you.